I want to share something with you that I have not always framed quite this directly. And I'd ask you to stay with it for a moment because it may genuinely change how you interpret what you see and don't see when you look at yourself in the mirror. There is a type of fat inside your body right now that you cannot see. You cannot pinch it. You cannot weigh it on a scale. It does not appear in photographs. It does not reveal itself when you pull in your stomach. It does not show up as the number on your bathroom floor at 6 in the morning. And yet, across the clinical and research literature I have spent years working within, this hidden fat may be the single most underestimated driver of biological aging in the modern human body. I came to this conclusion the way most meaningful clinical realizations arrive, not through a single dramatic discovery, but through a pattern in the data that became impossible to dismiss. Patients who appeared lean were aging rapidly at the cellular level. Patients who appeared heavier were sometimes aging slowly. And the variable that kept explaining the gap again and again was visceral fat. The fat that wraps around the liver, the pancreas, the intestines, the great vessels of the abdomen, the fat that does not sit on the surface of the body, the fat that lives deep within the peritoneal cavity and quietly, systematically, year by year, rewires your metabolic physiology into a state your cells experience as accelerated aging. What I find most clinically alarming about this is the following. You can be visibly lean and carry dangerous amounts of it. You can run regularly and carry it. You can eat what you genuinely believe is a healthy diet and still carry it. I have seen it in patients in their 30s. I have seen it in colleagues in their 40s. I have seen it in athletes in their 50s. And I will tell you with the kind of honesty that I think the clinical encounter demands, that I have seen it in myself. Several years ago, I went through a period of significant professional demand. Heavy fry for my and nauer sekber pri heavy travel, disrupted sleep, irregular meal timing, sustained cognitive load with insufficient recovery. My weight on the scale barely changed. My clothes fit roughly the same. When I finally ran a proper body composition analysis, the kind that measures visceral and subcutaneous fat separately, the visceral compartment had nearly doubled. In a physician who exercises consistently, who monitors nutritional intake, who has spent years in clinical practice studying metabolic health, that result made something concrete for me that had previously been only intellectual. This is not a problem of discipline or vanity. This is a problem of biology. And the biology moves against most of us, silently, continuously, in ways we are not equipped to detect until the damage is already meaningfully underway. What is actually happening inside the body? Let me walk you through the mechanism clearly, because once you understand it, you will not be able to encounter this subject superficially again. The subcutaneous fat, the fat you can pinch at your waist or your thigh, is largely metabolically quiet. It is storage tissue. It insulates, it cushions, and on most days it does not significantly disrupt your physiology. Visceral fat is categorically different. It behaves not like a passive storage depot, but like an active endocrine organ, one you did not choose to install, and one that works against your interests from the moment it begins to accumulate. It secretes pro-inflammatory cytokines continuously. It releases free fatty acids directly into the portal circulation, delivering a chronic lipid burden to the liver. It disrupts hormonal signaling at the cellular level, degrading the precision of the systems that regulate blood glucose, blood pressure, and metabolic rate. And the most clinically significant feature of visceral fat is the self-reinforcing loop it initiates. Visceral fat causes insulin resistance. Insulin resistance drives further visceral fat accumulation. Once that cycle is turning, it accelerates with each passing year, quietly, invisibly, until the day a routine blood panel reveals that fasting glucose is elevated, triglycerides are elevated, blood pressure is trending upward, and the patient sitting across from me genuinely cannot understand how they arrived there without changing anything obvious about their life. I want to be precise about insulin resistance because the term is widely used and rarely well explained. Insulin is the pancreatic hormone released in response to a rise in blood glucose following a meal. Its physiological function is straightforward. It travels through the circulation and signals muscle cells, hepatocytes, and adipocytes to take up and metabolize the available glucose. In a healthy metabolic state, that signal is received promptly and the glucose is cleared efficiently. In a body carrying excess visceral fat, cellular insulin sensitivity degrades. The signal is transmitted, but the response is blunted. The pancreas compensates by producing more insulin. More signal, attempting to overcome the reduced receptor response. For a period, this compensation is adequate, but it is also unsustainable. The pancreatic beta cells exhaust themselves over time. Cellular resistance deepens. Glucose remains in circulation longer, where it glycates proteins, damages the endothelium, and accelerates tissue aging at the molecular level. And the hyperinsulinemia itself, the chronically elevated insulin produced by the compensating pancreas, is a potent lipogenic signal, actively promoting further fat storage in the visceral compartment. That is the loop. That is the engine of metabolic aging that a significant proportion of the population is running continuously without awareness of it. The genuinely encouraging biology. What I want to be equally clear about is this: visceral fat, of all adipose compartments in the human body, is the most metabolically responsive and the most willing to mobilize. It is reliably the first fat to come off when effective interventions are applied. It is more sensitive to the physiological signals that drive lipolysis than subcutaneous fat. Your body, in some evolutionarily ancient sense, recognizes visceral fat as a liability, excess metabolic weight in a compartment where it creates functional interference. Given a credible signal that energy is required and that the metabolic environment demands adaptation, the body dismantles the visceral compartment first. The clinical implication is significant. The same biological process that has been accelerating your aging for years can be meaningfully reversed in weeks, not years. I have observed this in my own serial imaging. I have observed it in patients. I have observed it repeatedly in the research literature. The biology is genuinely on your side, provided you send it the right signals. The first signal, the right kind of movement. This is where I need to be direct with you because I think the current fitness conversation is leaving most people with an incomplete picture. Resistance training is one of the most important investments you can make in your long-term health. I practice it. I advocate it strongly to every patient I work with. Building and preserving skeletal muscle mass through the second half of life is among the most evidence-supported longevity interventions we have. Muscle is metabolically active tissue. It improves insulin sensitivity. It protects against sarcopenia, which is itself a strong independent predictor of mortality. But resistance training does not meaningfully reduce visceral fat. The data on this is consistent, and it matters that you hear it clearly. The barbell is not the tool for the visceral compartment. What moves visceral fat is vigorous aerobic work. Running, cycling, swimming, rowing. Sustained effort at an intensity where your breathing becomes effortful, where holding a conversation requires genuine concentration, where cardiovascular demand is real and sustained. 30 to 40 minutes of this, performed several times per week, produces a specific hormonal and metabolic signaling cascade that preferentially mobilizes visceral fat over other fat depots, not because of any particular metabolic zone mythology, but because of honest energy expenditure combined with the catecholamine-driven fat mobilization that vigorous aerobic work uniquely produces. The prescription is not complicated. It is not expensive. It does not require a specialist. It requires consistency and sufficient intensity. Two things the wellness industry has systematically undermined by making everything feel optional and everything feel gentle. The second signal, when you eat. Of all the interventions I've experimented with in my own physiology and observed in my patients, the timing of food intake has produced results in the visceral compartment that I find genuinely remarkable. I practice time-restricted eating. My eating window is typically 8 hours. I fast for the remaining 16, which in practical terms means I do not eat in the morning. This is not asceticism. I do not experience it as deprivation. What I experience during the fasted morning hours is clarity, cognitive sharpness, metabolic steadiness, and a kind of focused calm that I have come to associate with the physiological state the fast produces. Here is the biology behind that experience, because understanding it removes the mysticism entirely. During sleep, your body is in a fasting state. The liver is working through its glycogen stores, glycophor, winkrisfor, ampri, bistri, hakrister, whence the glucose polymer it holds in reserve for overnight energy maintenance. Somewhere between 10 and 12 hours of fasting, those stores are depleted. At that point, the body requires an alternative fuel source. It initiates lipolysis, verbakker in nauwetsurfering, and awasuffer kwawasker I kalser, the breakdown of stored fat, beginning with the visceral compartment, and ships the resulting fatty acids to the liver, where they are converted into ketone bodies. Those ketones enter the circulation, cross the blood-brain barrier, and are oxidized as cerebral fuel. This is the metabolic switch. It is not a modern invention or a dietary trend. It is ancient evolutionary programming. Our ancestors spent meaningful portions of every day in this state. Forigay. The switch was not an emergency response to scarcity. Was one per pine cowing, salt red brow and per restowen. It was a normal feature of metabolic life. And the ketones it produces are not merely an alternative fuel. They are signaling molecules. They upregulate GABA, the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter, producing the calm alertness many people describe when they have been fasting for several hours. They activate antioxidant response pathways. They reduce neuroinflammation. When you extend your overnight fast deliberately, our sulfate calmer our stalkrit purin sikri by simply not eating immediately upon waking, you are giving your body a window in which it can do work that continuous feeding prevents: autophagy, the cellular housekeeping process that removes damaged proteins and dysfunctional organelles; inflammatory downregulation, and active mobilization of the visceral compartment. I also want to address fasted exercise specifically because the data is worth your attention. Aerobic exercise performed in a fasted state produces measurably superior metabolic adaptations compared to the same exercise performed after eating. When the body is asked to perform sustained aerobic work without incoming glucose, it must become more efficient at fat oxidation. It upregulates mitochondrial biogenesis, the the creation of new cellular energy production units. It improves existing mitochondrial efficiency. It activates anti-inflammatory and antioxidant cascades that fed exercise does not produce to the same degree. For the 30 to 40-minute aerobic sessions that most people are performing, the evidence favors fasted execution. I will add a necessary clinical caveat: this is not a universal prescription. For high-volume endurance sessions, adequate fueling is essential. For some individuals, fasted exercise produces cortisol elevations that are counterproductive. Biology is not a rule book. It is an individual conversation. If fasted exercise feels acutely unwell rather than cleanly effortful, eat. The principle is to experiment with genuine attention to response, not to follow a protocol rigidly. A clinical note for women: and because the biology is not symmetrical. I want to address the female physiology specifically because treating this subject as uniform across sexes would be clinically irresponsible. Women's bodies are running a continuous background calculation regarding reproductive safety. That calculation is sensitive to energy availability, training load, and hormonal stability. Aggressive fasting protocols combined with high training volumes and insufficient recovery can suppress the hypothalamic pituitary ovarian axis in women of reproductive age, producing menstrual irregularity, disrupted hormonal profiles, and a range of downstream consequences that extend well beyond the reproductive system. To be precise, this is not the consequence of skipping breakfast before a morning walk. This is what happens in the context of severe caloric restriction, excessive training volume, and chronically poor recovery. Shui and Brel and Refry and a combination that represents physiological stress beyond what the system is designed to tolerate. The principle for all patients, regardless of sex: attend to your body's response as a primary data source. Genuine, consistent fasted training that produces increasing energy, improved performance, and stable mood is a signal that the approach is appropriate. Persistent fatigue, hormonal disruption, declining performance, and mood dysregulation are signals that the approach requires modification. What midlife does to the visceral compartment and why this matters urgently. The midlife hormonal transition is, in my view, one of the most clinically underdiscussed accelerators of visceral fat accumulation, and the patients most affected by it are frequently receiving the least specific information about it. In women, large prospective studies tracking body composition through the menopausal transition have documented visceral fat accumulation of 8 to 10% per year in the 2 years preceding the final menstrual period, driven primarily by the withdrawal of estrogen. Estrogen is a critical regulator of fat distribution. In the presence of adequate estrogen, adipose tissue is preferentially deposited in subcutaneous compartments, hips, thighs, gluteal tissue. As estrogen withdraws, that regulatory signal disappears. Fat migrates to the visceral compartment. This transition is not gradual in the way patients expect. It can feel metabolically almost sudden. Men are not exempt from this discussion. Testosterone declines at approximately 1% per year from the 4th decade onward. By the 7th decade, men may be carrying 200% more visceral fat than they carried in their 20s, and secrecy at essentially the same body weight. The scale has not moved meaningfully. The body composition has been rewriting itself for 40 years underneath it. This is the picture I need patients to hold clearly in mind. The visceral compartment grows quietly for decades. It does not announce itself with pain or obvious physical change. And then one day the blood work does. Elevated fasting glucose, elevated triglycerides, elevated inflammatory markers, elevated blood pressure. And the process that produced those numbers has been running for years before they appeared on the printout. The remaining signals worth sending. Sleep quality is one of the strongest determinants of visceral fat accumulation that most patients are not treating with adequate clinical seriousness. A single night of significant sleep deprivation produces measurable increases in cortisol, ghrelin, and inflammatory markers, all of which drive visceral accumulation and suppress fat mobilization. Chronic sleep restriction compounds these effects substantially. If you are sleeping less than 7 hours consistently, you are working against every other intervention you are attempting. Chronic psychological stress produces sustained cortisol elevation, which drives visceral deposition through the mechanisms I have described in previous discussions. Stress management is not a soft lifestyle recommendation. It is a specific metabolic intervention with direct consequences for the visceral compartment. Alcohol deserves particular attention here because its relationship to visceral fat is dose-dependent and underappreciated. Ethanol is metabolized preferentially, the liver processes it before other substrates, which means dietary fat and glucose are diverted towards storage, preferentially in the visceral compartment during the hours of alcohol metabolism. Regular evening alcohol consumption is one of the most consistent patterns I observe in patients who cannot understand why their visceral fat is not responding to otherwise sound dietary and exercise interventions. What this means for you practically: the visceral compartment is the most willing to leave of any fat in your body. It is the first to respond to metabolic intervention. The same biology that has been accumulating, it can be activated to dismantle it through vigorous aerobic exercise performed consistently, through time-restricted eating that allows the overnight metabolic switch to activate, through sleep that is protected rather than negotiated away, through cortisol that is managed rather than left to run continuously elevated, and through alcohol that is consumed with clear-eyed awareness of its metabolic cost. None of these interventions are exotic. None require specialist oversight for most patients. None require expensive products or proprietary protocols. They require what most genuinely effective medical interventions require: honest assessment of current habits, willingness to change the ones that are working against you, and consistency over a sufficient time horizon to allow the biology to respond. Within weeks of credible, consistent signaling, the visceral compartment begins to mobilize. Within months, the changes in body composition, inflammatory markers, insulin sensitivity, and subjective energy are typically transformative. Your body is not working against you. It is responding to the signals it is receiving. The clinical question is whether you are prepared to change what you are sending. The biology, ancient and adaptive and far more capable of recovery than most patients are led to believe, will do the rest.